It was Valentine's Day, but for Sarah, the usual warmth of the holiday felt distant, as if the world itself had shifted into a strange, unsettling place. The air outside was cold, biting, and the heavy clouds above promised nothing but the dull gray gloom that had haunted the town of Hollow Creek for days. But inside Sarah's small cottage, there was a strange anticipation in the air. It wasn't from the holiday, it was something else, something darker. Sarah wasn't expecting a Valentine's Day gift, not this year. Not after the accident. But when she'd come home from her job at the local bakery, she'd found something strange waiting for her on the front porch. A small package, wrapped in red paper with a bow that seemed too pristine, too perfect to be real. She hadn't even heard a car or footstep. No one had come by. A shiver ran down her spine, but she shook it off. It was probably just a delivery mistake, but when she picked it up, something about it felt wrong. Too heavy for its size. Too quiet. No card, no name. Just the odd sensation of being watched. Her heart hammered against her chest as she carried the gift into her cottage. The fire crackled in the hearth, a welcome warmth compared to the chilling scents that seemed to be growing around her. She placed the package down on her kitchen table, her eyes still lingering on the strange, unmarked gift. Curiosity gnawed at her. What could it be? Who would send her something without a name? It didn't make sense. With trembling hands, Sarah peeled back the red paper. Inside there was a small wooden box, old, worn, and marked with symbols she didn't recognize. But it was the smell that hit her first. A strong, pungent scent of something burning, like old incense, mixed with something earthy, like the damp soil of a forgotten grave. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't normal. She'd never seen anything like it. The symbols etched into the box pulsed with a faint light, like they were alive, moving beneath her fingers. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Her heart raced, but she couldn't stop herself from lifting the lid. She had to know what was inside. Inside the box, nestled in dark velvet, was a small figure, a dog sculpted from clay. At first glance, it looked like a harmless trinket, but upon closer inspection, Sarah's stomach twisted. The dog's eyes were hollow, its face contorted in an expression that could only be described as haunted. Its mouth was open as if it had been frozen in the middle of a howl, but the howl was silent. The figure had been baked, its body cracked in places, its texture rough and brittle. Yet it exuded an eerie sense of life, like something trapped inside the porcelain. It wasn't just a gift. It was something cursed, something old. Something that shouldn't have been here. Not for her. But then, as Sarah's hand hovered over the figure, something unexpected happened. The dog's eyes flickered. A low growl emanated from within the figure, the sound deep, unnatural. It rumbled like thunder, sending a jolt of terror through Sarah's body. The room grew colder. The fire in the hearth sputtered as if the heat had been drained out of it. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lengthen, as though they were reaching out toward her. Sarah stumbled backward, her pulse hammering in her ears. This wasn't a gift. It was a warning, asterisk asterisk. She dropped the box onto the table and stepped away, but the growl continued. Now it wasn't just in the figure. It was all around her, filling the room. The walls themselves seemed to hum with a menacing energy. Her eyes flicked to her dog, Max, who was lying by the fireplace. He stirred, lifting his head and looking around as if he had heard something too. His ears pricked up and he began to whimper, his eyes wide and panicked. "Max?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Max bolted upright, barking fiercely as he darted toward the box. But as he reached it, something strange happened. The dog figure began to glow, its cracked body suddenly alight with a sickly, greenish hue. Max froze, his eyes locked on the figure, his body rigid as if something had taken hold of him. Then without warning, the air around Sarah seemed to shift. The shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, darker. The temperature plunged further, and the world outside the cottage seemed to disappear. The wind stopped. The usual sounds of the town vanished. Everything was still. Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet begin to tremble. She grabbed the back of a chair, steadying herself as Max began to growl low in his throat. His fur stood on end and his body shook with terror. Then through the silence she heard a voice. It was soft, barely a whisper at first, but it grew louder, more insistent. "Take it back." Sarah spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. But there was no one there. No one except Max, who was now staring at the door, his tail tucked between his legs. "Take it back," the voice said again, clearer this time, like it was right in her ear. But there was still no one in sight. The voice sounded ancient, as if it had been waiting for years, centuries even, to be heard. And Sarah realized with growing dread that the dog figure was no ordinary object. It was a vessel. A vessel for something old, something ancient, and incredibly dangerous. Something that had been waiting for her. Sarah's mind raced. She had to get rid of it. The gift, this cursed thing, was never meant to be opened. But how? What was she supposed to do? The only thing she could think of was to return it, to undo whatever had been done. She needed to find out where it came from, who sent it, and why it had found its way to her. With trembling hands, she grabbed the figure and rushed out of the cottage. Max, now whimpering, followed at her heels. The wind had picked up outside, howling through the trees, but it was still eerily quiet. Too quiet. She made her way down the street, clutching the box tightly. The town of Hollow Creek was a small, sleepy place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business. But tonight it felt completely different. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner darker, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Sarah's footsteps echoed in the empty streets as she made her way to the old cemetery on the edge of town. It was a place that had always made her uneasy, even as a child. There were stories, whispers of curses, of restless spirits. But she had never believed them. Not until now. The cemetery gate creaked as she pushed it open, the sound unsettling in the stillness of the night. Max hesitated at the entrance but followed her in, his nervous energy only adding to the tension in the air. Sarah stopped at the oldest grave she could find, a crumbling tombstone hidden in the back corner of the cemetery. She dropped to her knees, her heart pounding in her chest, and placed the box on the ground before her. The wind howled louder, as if the very earth was protesting. The dog figure began to shake in the box, rattling like it was alive, and the ground beneath Sarah seemed to pulse with a dark energy. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Please let this end." But as she said the words, the dog figure glowed brighter, its cracked body writhing as if it was trying to escape. And then, in a sudden, bone-chilling flash of light, everything went black.
Sarah woke up on the cold, damp ground of the cemetery, her body aching, her mind clouded. The wind howled around her, tugging at her clothes and sending a chill deep into her bones. But when she opened her eyes, she wasn't in the place she remembered. The cemetery, the tombstones, they were still there, but the world around her had shifted. It wasn't just the air that was different. It was the entire landscape. The cemetery looked older, worn, like it had been abandoned for decades. The tombstones were cracked, covered in moss, some almost completely eroded away by time. The moon above was full, casting an eerie, almost unnatural glow on the world below. But there was something else, something far more unsettling. The ground beneath her felt wrong, soft, like it was shifting with every movement. She stood up, her legs unsteady, her head throbbing. Max was still by her side, but he wasn't his usual self. He stood, his fur bristled, his eyes wild with fear. He let out a low whimper, and Sarah followed his gaze. What she saw made her stomach drop. The graveyard was alive. Not in the sense that it had sprouted new life or plants, but in the way the earth itself seemed to move, shifting, pulling, pushing, as if something beneath the surface was trying to escape. The ground trembled once again, and Sarah stumbled back, clutching Max tightly. She looked down to see that the wooden box, the one with the dog figure, was no longer in her hands. It had vanished, as if swallowed by the earth itself. "Where is it?" she muttered, panic creeping into her voice. Max barked, his eyes wide, as if he knew something she didn't. He pulled at her, urging her to move, but Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the ever-moving ground beneath her feet. Suddenly, there was a sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere. Not from Max, but from deep within the earth, the very ground itself. The air turned cold, so cold that her breath turned to mist in the night. She looked up. The full moon was still there, but it had shifted into an unnatural shade of red. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, creeping like tendrils across the cemetery, encircling her. And then she heard it. The howl. It wasn't the howl of a regular dog. It was deep, guttural, echoing from the depths of the earth, as if it had been trapped there for centuries. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen with fear. The dog figure, it was calling to her. "Max, we have to go," she whispered, but her voice barely broke through the eerie silence. She turned to run, but before she could take a step, the ground in front of her cracked open with a loud, bone-rattling snap. The earth split wide, revealing a deep, black pit that seemed to lead to nowhere, a bottomless void that swallowed any light around it. And from that void something began to emerge. At first, it was only a flicker, a movement in the darkness, barely visible. But then, something monstrous rose from the pit. A massive, shadowy figure with glowing, red eyes that pierced through the darkness. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The dog. But it wasn't just any dog. It was huge, its body twisted and deformed. Its fur was matted with the filth of the grave, its claws sharp and black as night. It was no longer the small, harmless figure that had once been inside the wooden box. This thing had grown, morphed, fed on something deeper than mere magic. It was a creature born from the very darkness of the earth. Max barked frantically, but the creature remained still, its red eyes locked on Sarah as it crawled its way out of the pit. "Stay back, Max," Sarah whispered, but the fear in her voice betrayed her. The creature's head twisted unnaturally, and its lips curled into a grotesque snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It let out another growl, louder this time, vibrating the very air around them. The ground beneath Sarah's feet shook, the noise deafening. "Why are you here?" Sarah cried out, her voice trembling. The question came out before she could stop it. The creature's eyes never left her. For a long moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, its lips parted, and a voice, low, guttural, emerged from the depths of its throat. "You opened the door," it growled. "Now you must pay the price." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It could talk, but this wasn't just any creature. This thing was ancient, its voice dripping with centuries of anger and hunger. It wasn't speaking to her in words, it was speaking to her with the very essence of the curse that had been unleashed when she opened the box. The growl deepened, and the creature began to step forward, its heavy claws scraping against the stone as it moved closer. Max growled, but his voice was weak, strained. He stood between Sarah and the creature, trying to protect her, but she knew they wouldn't stand a chance. She needed to get out. She needed to escape. But the creature was already too close. It was no longer a dog, no longer an innocent thing. It was a force of nature, a wrathful being released from the depths of the earth by her own hand. "Please," Sarah whispered, her legs shaking beneath her. "What do you want from me?" The creature's eyes flickered, a dark satisfaction in its gaze. "It's not what I want," it snarled. "It's what you've invited. You've opened the door to the old world. And now you must take its place." Before Sarah could react, the creature lunged. Time seemed to slow as she braced herself for the impact, but Max moved faster than she could see. He threw himself at the creature, his jaws snapping, his teeth bared. The creature snarled in fury, pushing Max aside like he was nothing more than a bug. The air around Sarah seemed to crackle with energy as the beast turned its attention back to her. But before it could move any closer, something unexpected happened. The earth beneath them rumbled again, and a deep, resonant sound filled the air. The shadows receded, and the creature froze mid-step, its red eyes wide in confusion. The ground beneath them cracked open again, but this time, something different emerged. From the void below, a light, bright, pure, shot up into the sky. It was blinding, so bright that Sarah had to shield her eyes. The creature let out a feral scream, its body recoiling, and it began to retreat into the pit, as if the light was burning it. Before Sarah could make sense of it, the creature was gone, disappearing into the void, leaving only the eerie silence in its wake. The ground slowly stopped shaking, the light dimming as the pit closed behind it. Sarah fell to her knees, gasping for air, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Max stood by her side, panting heavily, his eyes still wide with fear. The cemetery was quiet once more. But there was something different about the air. Something darker. The curse had been lifted, for now. But Sarah knew it wouldn't be the last time she heard that howl. It was a warning. The dog wasn't gone. It would return. And when it did, Sarah would be ready. Thanks for following Sarah's journey. Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling, spine-tingling tales.